You want to see a magic trick? I'm going to turn this silver coin into 100 of them. Magic. I'm a caliper with 100 coins.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Monday morning, J-Snip4 here, Realist News on YouTube. Man, are some of y'all brutal. Let him talk, J-Snip. Shut the F up and let him talk. Let Bill Holter talk. Shut the F up. Holy crap. Jiminy Christmas. What's wrong with some of you people? Goodness gracious, I get it. Ask a little teeny tiny, very fast question and let my guests speak. Holy crap. Shut the F up, Chaser. Jiminy Christmas. Two things I want to talk about. Both from Zero Hedge, but Greg with US Day Watchdog. If you haven't seen this interview yet, David Stockman, everything will grind to a halt in 2017. Greg Hunter from USA Watchdog had him on, and I listened to it, but Zero Hedge kind of, since I'm checking out my news sources anyways, they got a small little clip article about it, a couple of key things he mentioned. But then I want to get into something else that I think is just as important. It goes in, right in line with this. Welcome to the Next Awakening. Author of Steve Bannon's Worldview explains the path ahead. Where did Steve Bannon get his worldview? From my book by Neil Howe at Washington Post. It says Neil Howe is the author, along with William Strauss, of Generations, The Fourth Turning, and Millennials Rising. He essentially coined that millennial term, I guess, in one of his earlier books, and that's what they talk about. But the key thing here that this article discussed at length is something they're calling, which is a book they wrote, The Fourth Turning. And there's four turning type of events. One, and it's like phases: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. All cyclical in nature, and they talk about how it's like generational. Each phase basically is a generation, or roughly 20 years, something like that. But to start with, and again, I'm going to post the links to these articles. You will find the link within the Zero Hedge page for Greg Hunter's interview of Dave Stockman. But that one, after March 15th this year, so we're talking, roughly 2 weeks, after March 15th, everything will grind to a halt. And what essentially he's talking about is that's when the debt ceiling, 20 trillion, kick the can debt ceiling expires. And his suggestion, or not his suggestion, but his thoughts are that, the club, the Democrats, the left, they're not going to want to kick the can now all of a sudden. That's what he's thinking. So we're going to have some major issues. Whereas we saw before, they're going to kick the can. They always do. They'll raise the debt ceiling. They always do. He thinks that's not going to be the case this time because Trump's in office, and the club, the Dems, are going to say, no, enough's enough. Now we don't want to do it. Sure, we did it for essentially all other presidents previous, 1 trillion, 2 trillion, 5 trillion, 10 trillion, now 20 trillion in debt. Both Democrats and Republicans, presidencies. But he's thinking they're not going to do it now for Trump. So he says 2 weeks after David Stockman warned that the market is apparently pricing in a huge Trump stimulus. But if you just look at the real world out there, the only thing that's going to happen is a fiscal bloodbath and a White House train wreck like never before in the history. That was his quote. And exclaimed that when looking at the markets, what's going on today is complete insanity. So he's back with another interview, this time with Greg Hunter of USA Watchdog, in which he once again warns that a giant fiscal bloodbath is coming soon, and urges listeners to pay especially close attention to the March 15th, 2017 debt ceiling deadline, at which point everything could grind to a halt. Of course, could doesn't mean yes for sure or no. But again, David Stockman seems to think so. Now, keep in mind, I guess you can say it here anyways. Former Reagan administration White House budget director David Stockman, okay, this guy's been next to Ronald Reagan in the White House, budget director, says financial pain is a mathematical certainty. Now that's funny because when I just got done talking to Bill Holter, as you saw, and some of you, I should say, yelled at me, "Shut the F up." He too said this is a mathematical certainty. Stockman explains, quote, "I think we are likely to have more of a fiscal bloodbath rather than fiscal stimulus. Unfortunately for Donald Trump, not only did the public vote the establishment out, they left on his doorstep the inheritance of 30 years of debt buildup and a fiscal policy that's been really reckless in the extreme. People would like to think he's the second coming of Ronald Reagan, and we are going to have mourning in America. Unfortunately, I don't think it looks that promising because Trump is inheriting a mess that pales into insignificance what we had to deal with in January of 1981 when I joined the Reagan White House as budget director," he said. So can Donald Trump bump, or what they call the Trump bump, in the stock market keep going? Stockman, who wrote a book titled Trumped, Predicting a Trump Victory in 2016, says, "I don't think there's a snowball's chance in the hot place. That's going to happen. This is delusional. This is the greatest suckers rally of all time," which I have to give Lindsey Williams credit because he did say that was going to happen after 2008. You will see the markets rise higher and higher until they hit absurd levels. When you say they can't go any higher, they're going to go higher. When you think it's as high as it could go, it's beyond nuts, it's going to go higher. Is that not what we've seen? Dow 20,000? I mean, come on. It is based on pure hopium, which I like that word, and not any analysis at all as what it will take to push through a big tax cut. Donald Trump is in a trap. Today the debt is $20 trillion. It's 106% of GDP. Trump is inheriting a built-in deficit of $10 trillion over the next 10 years under current policies that are, again, built in. Yet he wants more defense spending, not less. He wants drastic sweeping tax cuts for corporations and individuals. He wants to spend more money, on border security and law enforcement. He's going to do more for the veterans. He wants this big $1 trillion infrastructure program. You put all that together and it's madness. It doesn't even begin to add up. And it won't happen when you are struggling with the $10 trillion of debt that's coming down the pike and the $20 trillion that's already on the books, he says. He says, finally, Stockman drops this bomb and says, "I think what people are missing in this date, March 15th, 2017, that's the day that this debt ceiling holiday that Obama and John Boehner, when he was Speaker of the House, put together right before the last election of October of 2015, he says," which maybe he meant 2016, but it wasn't before the last election. It was way before that, but nonetheless, he's right. That holiday expires. The debt ceiling will freeze in at $20 trillion. It will then be law. It will be a hard stop. The Treasury will have roughly $200 billion in cash. We are burning cash at $75 billion a month currently. By summer, they will be out of cash. Then we will be in the mother of all debt ceiling crises. Everything will grind to a halt. I think we will have a government shutdown. There will not be Obamacare repeal and replace. There will be no tax cut. There will be no infrastructure stimulus. There will be just one giant fiscal bloodbath over a debt ceiling that has to be increased and no one wants to vote for. He also predicts very positive price moves for gold and silver as a result of the coming budget calamity. So he says there's much more in the interview with Greg Hunter, which again you'll see when I put this link in if you want to go check it out. But let's talk about that for a second. If we're to just go off of some puzzle pieces, if you will, that didn't quite have a fitting place yet, but yet stand out blaringly, such as the 1988 cover of The Economist magazine, the Club's magazine, that said, "Get ready for a new world currency in 2018. And then I found that little blog the other day that found the page that talked about it within the magazine. And it talked about on or about 2018. The Phoenix currency, whatever, and it talked about the IMF currency and all that. But if we're to expect problems that will help help usher in a one world currency where all countries say, yeah, we're all hurting and we need to do this. Upping the debt ceiling for the upteenth time and allowing Trump to spend all this money and life is good, everything's fine, doesn't quite fit into that picture. So what actually fits into that picture is what this gentleman just said. The fact that we have 10 trillion already on the books for the next 10 years, the 20 trillion we have to deal with now, and now Trump wants to, again, expand even more. Bigger military, bigger budgets, bigger everything. And he thinks the Democrats and GOP together are going to say no this time. And they're going to blame it. It'll look like it's blamed on Trump. That's his opinion. It is his opinion. He's not an insider per se, even though he was in the Reagan White House. I've never found that David Stockman was an insider, but he certainly knows what he's talking about. That's for sure. So one would be wise to listen. And did you catch the last thing it said? Stockman also predicts very positive price moves for gold and silver as a result of the coming budget calamity. Wow, quick look surprise. How many times have I screamed, about precious metals? So the other thing, this other four turning points, which is very interesting to me. Welcome to the New Awakening, author of Steve Bannon's Worldview Explains the Path Ahead. The headlines this month have been alarming. Steve Bannon's obsession with a dark theory of history should be worrisome. According to Business Insider, Steve Bannon believes the apocalypse is coming and war is inevitable, says the Huffington Post. And again, Huffington Post, I get it. Steve Bannon wants to start World War III, The Nation. A common thread in these media reports is that President Trump's chief strategist is an avid reader and that the book that most inspires his worldview is a book called The Fourth Turning, An American Prophecy. He says, I wrote the book with William Strauss back in 1997. It is true that Bannon is enthralled by it. In 2010, he released a documentary called Generation Zero that is structured around our theory that America, or history in America, and by extension most other modern societies, unfolds in a recurring cycle of 4-generation-long eras. While this cycle does include a time of civic and political crisis, a fourth turning in our parlance, the reporting on the book has been absurdly apocalyptic. I don't know Bannon well. I have worked with him on several film projects, including Generation Zero, which, by the way, I'm going to say, note to self, I'm going to go find this documentary. Maybe it's on Netflix. If not, I'll find it online somewhere because I want to watch it. I don't know if I've seen that. So he says, I've worked with him on several film projects, including Generation Zero, over the years. I've been impressed by his cultural savvy. His politics, while unusual, never struck me as offensive. I was surprised when he took over the leadership of Breitbart and promoted its views espoused on that site. Like many people, I first learned about the alt-right, which is essentially a far-right movement with links to Breitbart and a loosely defined white nationalist agenda from the mainstream media. Strauss, who died in 2007, and I never told Bannon what to say or think. But we did perhaps provide him with an insight that populism, nationalism, and state-run authoritarianism would soon be on the rise, not just in America, but around the world. Anyways, he says, the cycle begins with the first turning, a high, which comes after a crisis era. In a high, institutions are strong and individualism is weak. Society is confident about where it wants to go collectively, even if many feel stifled by the prevailing conformity. Many Americans alive today can recall post-World War II American high, according to historian William O'Neill's term, coinciding with the Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy presidencies. Earlier examples are the post-Civil War Victorian high of industrial growth and stable families and the post-Constitution high of democratic republicanism and era of good feelings. The second turning is an awakening when institutions are attacked in the name of higher principles and deeper values, just when society is hitting its high tide of public progress. People suddenly tire of all the social discipline and want to recapture a sense of personal authenticity. Salvation by faith, not works, is the youth rallying cry. One such era was the consciousness revolution of the late 1960s and 1970s. Some historians call this America's fourth or fifth great awakening, depending on whether they start the count in the 17th century with John Winthrop or the 18th century with Jonathan Edwards. The third turning is an unraveling. In many ways, the opposite of the high. Institutions are weak and distrusted. Sound familiar? What institutions are weak, as in insolvent, and distrusted? Oh, the banking system institutions. While individualism is strong and flourishing. Third turning decades, such as the 1990s and 1920s and 1850s, are notorious for their cynicism, bad manners, and weak civic authority. Government typically shrinks, and speculative manias, when they occur, are delirious. And finally, the fourth turn, or turning, is a crisis period. This is when our institutional life is reconstructed from the ground up, always in response to a perceived threat to the nation's very survival. If history does not produce such an urgent threat, fourth turning leaders will invariably find one, and may even fabricate one. False flag, anyone? To mobilize collective action. Civic authority revives, and people and groups begin to pitch in as participants in a larger community. As these Promethean bursts of civic effort reach their resolution, fourth turnings refresh and define our national identity. The years 1945, 1865, and 1794 all capped eras constituting new founding moments in American history. Just as a second turning reshapes our inner world of values, culture, religion, a fourth turning reshapes our outer world of politics, economy, and empire. In our paradigm, one can look ahead and suggest that a coming time period, say a certain decade, will resemble, in its essential human dynamic, a time period in the past. In the fourth turning, we predicted that starting around 2005, and in his book, The Fourth Turning, we predicted that starting around the year 2005, America would probably experience a great devaluation in financial markets, a catalyst that would mark America's entry into an era whose first decade would likely parallel to the 1930s, right after the Great Depression started. That's interesting, isn't it? Reflecting on the decade we've just lived through, we can probably agree that the 1930s parallel works well. In the economy, both decades played out in the shadow of a global financial crisis and were characterized by slow and disappointing economic growth and chronic underemployment of labor and capital. Both saw tepid investment, deflation fears, growing inequality, and the inability of central bankers to rekindle consumption. In geopolitics, we've witnessed the rise of isolationism, nationalism, and right-wing populism across the globe. Geostrategist Ian Bremmer says we now live in a G0 world, where it's every nation for itself. And isn't that interesting? What's Donald Trump about? America first only. And he has said to other nations, you should be about your country first, we'll be about our country first. And I think that's exactly what's going to be happening. The story echoes of the 1930s, which witnessed the waning authority of great power alliances and a new willingness by authoritarian regimes to act with terrifying impunity. In social trends, the two decades also show parallels. Falling rates of fertility and home ownership, the rise of multi-generational households, the spread of localism and community identification, a dramatic decline in youth violence, a fact that apparently has eluded the president, and a blending of pop youth culture. Above all, we sense a growing desire among voters around the world for leaders to assert greater authority and deliver deeds rather than process results rather than abstractions. We live in an increasingly volatile and primal era in which history is speeding up and liberal democracy is weakening. As Vladimir Lenin wrote, in some decades, nothing happens. In some weeks, decades happen. Makes me wonder if the whole March kick the can debt ceiling issue might be, if it goes the way Mr. Stockman thinks, that would certainly be decades happening in weeks, if you will. That'd be interesting to see when we get there, though. And I've said it before because about something like that, when we were kicking the can before, I was doing my videos, and them not kicking the can and not raising the debt ceiling, I was talking then, like them not doing that would make me think all the stuff that Webbot's been talking about all these years and in recent times is right around the corner. It's going to play out. But then they kicked the can. Nothing happened. Just dragged it on. So now if the day comes this March, let's say, and they don't kick the can, let's say they don't, then I think we could see rapid movement towards all the stuff the Webbot said to look out for. Not good, which also leads to high precious metals prices. Not good either for society. Very good for you and me, but still not good for everything else. Anyways, he says, America entered a new fourth turning in 2008. Well, let me read the last paragraph before that, though. If we look at the broader rhythms of history, we have reason to be heartened, not discouraged, by these trends. Anglo-American history of the past several centuries has experienced civic crises in a fairly regular cycle of about 80 to 90 years, or roughly the length of a long human life. These patterns, or this pattern, reveals itself in the intervals separating the colonial glorious revolution, the American Revolution, the Civil War, and the Great Depression, and World War II. Fast forward the length of a long human life from the 1930s, and we end up where we are today, about 80 or 90 years later, right? America entered a new fourth turning point in 2008. It is likely to last until 2030. That's interesting because what is Martin Armstrong's charts, and they've always shown this, 2016, top peak, and then all the way down to approximately 2030, 2031 is just this downward. And that also is his main real estate chart. It looks the same. 2016 downward to 2032. Next 16 years not looking good. So it's likely to last until 2030. Our paradigm suggests that current trends will deepen as we move toward the halfway point. Further adverse events, possibly another financial crisis or a major armed conflict, will galvanize public opinion and mobilize leaders to take more decisive action. Rising regionalism and nationalism around the world could lead to fragmentation of major political entities, perhaps the European Union, and the outbreak of hostilities, perhaps in the South China Sea or the Korean Peninsula, the Baltic States, or the Persian Gulf, etc. Despite a new tilt toward isolationism, the United States could find itself at war. I certainly do not hope for war. I simply make a sobering observation, and that is this. Every total war in U.S. history has occurred during a fourth turning point, and no fourth turning point has yet unfolded without one. America's objectives in such a war are likely to be defined very broadly. Welcome to the next awakening. The cycle of history keeps turning inexorably. Sometime in the late 2030s, the first millennial will be voted into the White House, prompting talk of a new Camelot moment. Anyways, two really interesting things to talk about, very worthy. Again, David Stockman was in the White House, budget advisor, President Reagan. If a guy like that talks, you got to listen. You know what I mean? And it's great to have guests on your show or your interview or whatever. But when a guy like that steps on the show, comes on and talks to you like he did with Greg Hunter, one would be very wise to listen to that individual. So, take care. On to the next.